You really can't tell the story of America without telling the story of immigration. They're one and the same. There's this powerful idea, right? This national myth that America wasn't just some accident of history, but a nation built on purpose. Not just by the choices of its founders, but by the millions and millions of people who chose to come here, to be a part of it. And nothing captures that myth better than these words, right? They're etched at the base of the Statue of Liberty. It paints this incredibly powerful, romantic picture of America as a safe harbor, a land of second chances for the wretched refuse of the world. It's a beautiful image for sure. But is it the whole story? Not even close. The reality is way more complicated and honestly pretty contradictory. So that brings us to the big question we're going to tackle. Has America really always welcomed the world with open arms?
All right, so let's dig in. And the best place to start, maybe surprisingly, is with economics. Because from the very beginning, setting aside all the lofty ideals, the raw physical growth of the United States created this constant, almost insatiable need for labor.
I mean, if you look at it from a purely economic standpoint, the math was simple. Immigrants were a massive asset. They were the ones who populated the vast interior of the country. They provided the cheap labor that powered the Industrial Revolution. And here's the kicker. The cost of raising them, educating them, that was all covered by their home countries. Plus, employers often didn't have to worry about things like social welfare. It was a perfect system for super fast, super cheap growth. Okay, but here's the thing. This purely economic view, it didn't just exist on its own. It immediately created this deep, fundamental tension. And that sparked a debate that really has been raging in one form or another for centuries. And you can basically break that debate down into two competing camps. On one side, you've got the nativists. They've always seen immigrants as a threat to jobs, to social stability, and to what they saw as the core Anglo-American culture. But on the other side, you have this really fascinating, kind of strange alliance. You've got pluralists who believe in the value of diversity, teaming up with business owners who frankly just wanted cheap labor. And these two competing visions of what America should be, well, they've been clashing since day one. So what this really tells us is that this whole debate, it was never just about money or jobs. It has always been about identity. It forces Americans to ask this really deep, fundamental question, who are we? And the idea that the answer might be, well, we are everyone, that's just not an answer a lot of people were or are willing to accept. And this wasn't just some philosophical debate happening in newspapers. Nope. This conflict got written directly into the law books. It shaped the actual legal code that decided who could become an American and who couldn't. Just look at this timeline. It really tells the story. Back in 1795, citizenship was explicitly limited to freeborn white persons. Fast forward to 1882, and you get the Chinese Exclusion Act, the very first time a specific national group was banned. Then in 1924, the government creates this quota system that basically established a hierarchy of desirability, putting Northern Europeans at the top. You can see the trend, right? It goes from a relatively open door to a system that's super selective, and that pretty much holds until everything changes in 1965.
And if you want to see what that legal hierarchy looked like in real life, just compare Ellis Island and Angel Island. For Europeans coming to New York, Ellis Island was, for the most part, a gateway. Sure, it was bureaucratic and impersonal, but something like 99% of people who arrived were let in. But for Asians, especially the Chinese, arriving at Angel Island in San Francisco, it was a totally different story. It was a barrier. They faced these long, grueling interrogations, and about a quarter of them were sent back. Two coasts, two completely different realities.
Okay, so we've been looking at this mostly from the American side of things. But let's flip the script for a minute. What about the immigrants themselves? It's really easy to fall back on that image from the poem, the huddled masses, just passively waiting. But that's not the whole picture at all. These were people making active, calculated choices. There's this great term for it, the venturesome conservative. It sounds like a contradiction, but it perfectly captures their mindset. These weren't just desperate people fleeing chaos. They were strategic thinkers. They were using a very modern and very risky strategy, moving across the world to achieve an incredibly traditional and conservative goal, just taking care of their families. And you can see this strategy playing out in the hard numbers. We're looking at remittances here. That's money sent back home. And the amounts are just staggering for that time period. I mean, look at the Slovaks. They sent back the equivalent of $200 million over 4 decades. This wasn't just sending a few bucks home. This was a full-blown global economic strategy. It was a lifeline that supported entire towns and villages back in the old country.
All right, that brings us to the modern era, and to what is probably the single most important piece of immigration law in the last century. I'm talking about the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. This law completely, fundamentally reshaped the country, and it had consequences that honestly, even the people who championed it never saw coming.
So before 1965, the system was designed to do one thing, and one thing only: keep the country's ethnic makeup pretty much the same as it had always been. The whole national origins quota system was set up to make sure the vast majority of immigrants, we're talking 85%, came from Northern and Western Europe.
But then the 1965 Act comes along and gets rid of those quotas, and boom, the pattern completely flips on its head. In the decades after that law passed, more than 80% of new immigrants came from Asia and Latin America. It's ironic, really. The supporters of the law actually promised it wouldn't change the country's ethnic balance. Instead, it kicked off one of the most dramatic demographic shifts in all of American history.
So that huge shift brings us right up to today. And what's so fascinating is that even though the faces of the immigrants have changed dramatically, the core arguments, the central debate, it hasn't really changed at all. Think about it. When you hear people today arguing about how immigration affects wages or changes the culture or impacts national security, you're not listening to a new debate, not at all. You're hearing echoes of a conversation that's as old as America itself. The specific words might be different, but the fundamental questions are exactly the same. And that brings us right back to where we started. This whole long, complicated, and often contradictory history, that's the backdrop for everything we see happening today. And understanding that history really forces us to ask a big question. Is the story of American immigration a finished chapter in a history book? Or are we living in the middle of a story that's still being written?